My name is Bill Jancewicz, and I'm going to talk about the old Western Cree Bible. Plain Cree is exactly what is printed on the overleaf on this 1908-1904 edition containing both the Old and the New Testaments. This talk is not about Eliot's 1663 Bible, but I'll begin with this first slide to provide some timeline perspective. This event, the publication of the first Bible, is more than 360 years ago. John Eliot's Wampanoag, Massachusetts Bible is not only the first Bible printed in the Americas, but it is also the first Bible of any North American Indigenous language. The Cree Bible that we're talking about today was first published more than 150 years ago. It's very often referred to as the Mason Bible. It was only the second Bible in a First Nation language. Unfortunately, when the first edition was published in 1861-62, it only had one name listed on the title page, that of William Mason. You'll find that the publication date in the literature is sometimes 1861, sometimes 1862. This is because the Old Testament was published in 1861 and the New Testament in 1862, and these are the dates listed on the title pages of the respective sections. They were generally bound together in one volume. Up until recently, these Cree translations were referred to in terms of the non-Indigenous European missionaries who were involved with them in various ways. But in fact, we often discovered that there was significant involvement by Indigenous speakers of these languages. Besides the stories of the Cree elders who were given the syllabic characters that were used by James Evans to write and print these words, there are several other Indigenous persons who were deeply involved in the preparation of this first Cree translation of the Bible. Evans and Mason were both born in England and came over to North America as Wesleyan Methodist missionaries. But Sophia Thomas was a mother tongue Cree speaker from Red River. So in Giesecke, Seinhauer was an Anishinaabe from the Rama First Nation community. John Sinclair was a Cree from Oxford House. And John Alexander Mackay was a Cree from Mistassini, Quebec. The timeline of the interactions of these individuals and their relationships is a fascinating one. Here's the timeline of the 19th century into the first 2 decades of the 20th century. James Evans was born in England, and he moved with his family to Upper Canada. He first worked with the Anishinaabe community near Rice Lake, and then devises Ojibwe syllabics. But the writing system was rejected for use by the Bible Society. He then takes a new posting with the Cree at Rossville in 1840, and that winter he revises his syllabic system to work for Cree. James Evans, who has been credited with the development of the syllabic writing system, began his work near Rice Lake, Ontario. But starting in 1840, he works with the Cree in Rossville. Rossville was established as a Wesleyan Methodist mission community just outside Norway House, the Hudson's Bay Company trading post on the Nelson River. Take note of this spot at the center of the map. This is a very important location with regard to both the spread of the syllabic writing system and the translation of the Cree Bible. Sophia Thomas was born around 1815, and along with a number of her siblings and her mother was baptized at the age of 7 in 1822 at Red River. Sophia was the youngest daughter of Hudson Bay Company chief factor Thomas and his Cree wife Sarah. She received her education from Church of England missionaries at an early age. She was known as an apt pupil and a good pious girl, and she grew up as a devout Christian. In 1843, she married the Reverend William Mason, and with her knowledge of Cree and her sincere interest in the welfare of her people, she was a great help to her husband's ministry at Rossville and again at York Factory. Although she had a delicate constitution, Sophia was reputed to have devoted herself unceasingly to the operation of the day school, visiting the sick, translating hymns and the scriptures. Her lasting legacy was her work on the translation of the Cree Bible. After her marriage to William Mason, Sophia spent most of the rest of her life at Rossville and at York Factory. William Mason was born in England in 1816. He went to Canada as a missionary with the Wesleyan Methodists and took his first assignment at Lac La Pluie in 1840. He married Sophia Thomas in 1843, and the two together went to Rossville. Upon Evan's departure in 1845, he took charge of Rossville, where the first commercial printing press arrived. When the Wesleyan Methodists left Rossville in 1854, he took his priest's orders from the Church of England. He continued coordinating the translation work until 1858, when he and Sophia traveled to England to oversee the typesetting and the publication. In 1862, he returned to Canada with approximately 1,000 copies of the Bible and 2,000 copies of the New Testament. He established himself at York Factory, where, for the next 8 years, he served the Church Missionary Society and distributed the Bibles. He returned to England permanently in 1870. Here are William Mason's locations in North America during the period in focus. The Anishinaabe, who was baptized Henry Bird Steinhauer in 1828, was originally named Soangiesic. He took the name after Methodist missionary William Case found an American benefactor who agreed to provide for his education. In 1840, he went to Lac La Pluie, where he assisted William Mason as translator, interpreter, and teacher. 2 years later, at the request of James Evans, he went to Rossville. He readily mastered Cree because he spoke Anishinaabe. Thus, he assisted him in translating the Bible and hymns. Soangiesic was the chief translator at Norway House by 1846. In 1851, he was asked to establish a Methodist mission at Oxford House, 200 miles northeast of Norway House. In the fall of 1854, he went to England to publicize the missionary work and returned the following spring. He was ordained by the Wesleyan Methodist Church in 1855, and that same month he received his first posting to Lac La Biche in Alberta, but moved to establish his own work at Whitefish Lake, north of Edmonton. John Sinclair was born in Oxford House in 1830. He was sent to Rossville around 1840 for his education and worked closely with James Evans and Soangiesic, and then later with William and Sophia Mason on the Bible translation. He married Betsy Omand from York Factory in 1851 and moved to Oxford House in 1863. He returned to Norway House 10 years later and worked as a clerk for the Hudson Bay Company, but afterwards he set up a trading company of his own to compete with Hudson Bay. It was recorded that, while at Rossville, John Sinclair translated the first draft of the Old Testament from the Psalms to Malachi, and the New Testament from the book of Romans to Revelation, while Soangiesic translated the first draft of the Old Testament from Genesis to Job, and the Gospels and Acts in the New Testament. John Alexander Mackay was born in 1838 in Mistissini, Quebec. Although he was the son and grandson of men who worked for the Hudson Bay Company, J.A. Mackay did not follow in their footsteps, but he chose a life of religious ministry, and although he was baptized in the Methodist Church, he was associated with the Church of England early on, serving under E.A. Watkins at Fort George in Quebec in 1855, and then he went on to Moose Factory in Ontario to receive Church of England catechist training under John Horden at Moose Factory, Ontario. He enrolled in St. John's College in Red River, Manitoba at the end of 1850s. He was ordained a priest in 1862 and went on to York Factory, where he worked alongside William Mason, who had just returned to Canada from England with his supply of newly printed Cree Bibles. Many of these new Cree Bibles went with him as he continued his service to his people in other places. He moved to the Pas, Manitoba, where he served from 1864 to 1865, and then transferred to Stanley Mission, Saskatchewan, where he worked for another 10 years. There he was involved in Cree language translation of scripture and church-related materials. J.A. Mackay had a long and multifaceted ministry all across Cree territory. In 1876, he was transferred to the Battlefords area of Saskatchewan, where he started an Indigenous church. In 1879, he was one of the founding staff members at Emmanuel College in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, where he taught Cree grammar and composition to Cree speakers, a remarkable achievement in its time. In 1887, Mackay was appointed principal at Emmanuel, which had just then achieved university status. He continued to serve as Cree tutor and worked on the translation of the Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and the Cree Hymn Book, as well as working on revisions of other translators' works. He was asked to oversee the revision of the Cree Bible by the committee. And over the course of about 10 years, Mackay completed his work and made 3 trips to England to see the revised publication through printing, which was finished in 1908. Very quickly here, this last timeline slide illustrates the intersection of all these individuals who were most involved in the translation, production, distribution, and revision of what has been called the Mason Cree Bible. The first phase set the stage, bringing most of the participants together at Rossville, near Norway House. This is likely when the first draft was produced, mainly by Soan Giesecke and John Sinclair. The second phase begins about 1850, as Soan Giesecke and then Sinclair leave Rossville, leaving Mason and Sophia to complete the checking and proofreading, and thus bring the work to publication. The third phase is the printing and distribution phase from about 1858 to 1870. Importantly, Mason and Mackay worked together in York Factory during this time for the distribution and use of the new Cree Bibles. After Mason returns to England, the fourth phase begins. The 3 remaining Indigenous participants, Soan Giesecke, John Sinclair, and Mackay, continue to use and teach the Cree Bible to their own people within their own spheres of influence. J.A. Mackay thus is ideally prepared and positioned to perform the revision of the text at the turn of the century. I believe that one of the important reasons that this translation has so much influence and continues to be used by thousands of Cree speakers across Canada during the past century and a half is that from the earliest days of the translation process, it was a work by and for Indigenous persons. The next part of this presentation is a brief description and analysis of the translated text. The original syllabic text of the J.A. Mackay revision was transcribed, digitized, and converted into standard Roman orthography. Next, a software program was used with interlinearizing capabilities to analyze each line of text. This interlinearization is what you will find in the published version of this presentation. You'll observe that the interlinear display is divided into 2 columns. The analysis of the legacy Mason Cree text is on the left, with a corresponding interlinear analysis of the contemporary Cree translation that was published by the Bible Society in 2018. The section of text studied here is the well-known story of the Good Samaritan, found in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10. I've used the convention of marking first person, second person, and third person participants with numerals. 1 is first person, 2 is second person, and so on. The further third person, or the obviative, is marked with the numeral 4. I would like you to look at with me the text of verses 33 and 34, where the Samaritan meets the injured traveler and has pity on him, goes to him, treats his injuries, and brings him to an inn to be cared for. We will listen to these 2 verses read in the 2 different translations. The Legacy Cree Bible on the left is read by the Reverend Fred Evans of Swan River, Manitoba. The Contemporary Cree translation on the right is read by Dolores Sand of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan.
Magapeg Shamertana Megoch Epimipichi Kepe Tosteo Iteat Ishmima Weop Megut Egitimagenat Egenat Tegutmaga Ege Tahupitami Umishoganigat Teguina Etuminamit Mina Eshiginamagut Suminapo Minege Tehtapigut Yechuak Upishishkiniwa Ege Peshigut Kapeshigamugo Minege Kanoemegut
Mage Gopek Napil Samaria Skikote Epimote Hot Ekota Wistawapa Meumina Mista Hekitimaginawel Exe Natat Kikasia Bawahil Pimi Mina Suminapoi Eapatitat Itaka Ki Pakamahomit Exe Kiwewe Kapitat Ki Tetapihil Utemik Mina Ki Tohtahil Kapisu Kamukok Mina Ki Pamehil.
First, let's look at the lexical items that are nearly identical in the two translations. The words shomanapoi, wine, and kapeshiwigamaguk, in. The only difference are a few phonological and orthographical inconsistencies. Now let's examine some items that are completely different. The Old Cree translation uses the verb dominam, to anoint with oil, whereas the Contemporary Cree translation uses a noun, pami, oil, and the word for wine, as a compound subject of the verb e apichitat, he uses it. And the Old Cree uses the possessive of the word pisiskeo, beast or domestic animal, with an obviative suffix, while the Contemporary Cree has utem, his horse, with the locative suffix. Finally, we'll look at the obviative marking of the participants. In the Old Cree Bible, we have the inverse marking on the verb natagut. He, fourth person, comes to him, third person. The Contemporary Cree renders this with a direct marking, natat. He, third person, comes to him, fourth person. So for the Old Cree, this entire segment marks the Samaritan as obviative and the wounded man as proximate, whereas in the Contemporary Cree, it is the wounded man who is obviative and the Samaritan is proximate. This can also be observed throughout with other noun and verb inflections, such as ki tetapihikut, to mount or sit on, in the Old Cree, and ki tetapihau, mount or sit on, in the Contemporary Cree. This difference is also indicated in the verb ki kenawaimagut, he was cared for, in the Old Cree, and ki pemahau, he tended him, in the Contemporary Cree. The comparison serves to illustrate one of the challenges associated with translating English texts into Cree that also occurs in other Algonquian languages. This challenge is the need for the translator to determine which of the two third-person participants in different roles was foregrounded from the perspective of the original storyteller, and whether the original storyteller intended to keep that participant focus throughout. In this small example, we observe how the translator of a contemporary text shifted the focus in verse 33 by introducing the Samaritan as proximate, after initially using proximate marking on the wounded man. In contrast, the translator of the Old Cree Bible tells the story without shifting the focus, leaving the wounded man as proximate throughout. Translators are faced with these kinds of decisions often and must consider the purpose of the story that was in the mind of the original storyteller, so that the resulting story in Cree produces a similar effect. This is really just the briefest beginnings of what could be said about the language of the Old Cree Bible. It has been a wonderful privilege for me to get to know some of the Indigenous persons whose lives have been influenced and transformed by this book, and I am grateful for their help and their kindness and their patience. And I will continue to learn and to listen and to read. Thank you very much. Jiniskumit.